Yeah, we have enough to start. Let's start with public comment. Is there any public comment this evening?
Hello, my name is William Patchell. I live at 404 Bonnie Lane. Same procedures we have during the work session, so I wouldn't have missed this. This is a momentous occasion for the district. Now that we're televising this, I almost feel like, is this like Alan Shepard, John Glenn, or what's going on here? So I feel very happy to be here at the liftoff stage for the public to see what goes on. So my topic tonight is, and I would like to make the board, I concluded my other efforts with the district, and I got the concussions down from 15 to 5. They might have blipped up, but I've left that alone for a while. My new topic now is to make this district have the finest bus fleet that's in the Commonwealth. And when the people come out there, they said, right from curb service, wow, this is pretty fantastic. And I also mentioned I did want to have we have to go by the lowest bid. And I understand this is a really monumental thing because we're changing from diesel to propane. That's going to be a giant improvement over the carbon footprint. We have to demonstrate to the district that we are committed not only to bricks and mortar, but to the infrastructure and the transportation necessities which are going to come forward. And I said, you need to buy the vehicles that are going to perform over a long, long period of time. We have 140 buses. If we were to do 20, if you buy 20 and you did that every other year, it would take 14 years to replace all these buses. And I want to know what that total cost would be. And I pointed out to Mr. Shiraki, I don't know if other people had thought about this, when you have one type of manufacturer, what you're having is, yes, we have a new airline here. We have all new Dreamliners. Wow, it's really fantastic. They save a ton of fuel. You know, why would you want to have a composite mixture of, like, I almost feel sorry for the mechanics now. Because if any of you went there and talked to them, oh, yeah, we got this, we got International, we got Thomas, we've got, wow. I really feel sorry for them. 6 people are doing a fantastic job, and I don't think anyone is really aware of it. Those buses pull up. Wow, 6 people are responsible for all the maintenance in this district. And you know what? I don't know. They have little wings on their back and a halo, but I don't know. I haven't seen that, but I spoke to Nick at the garage. And so carrying on, I talked to Brightbill out there, and they are the distributor for Bluebirds. I would like this district to buy American. Now, I know we got to get the cheapest price. You know, you can get the cheapest thing. You know, they used to sell Yugos. Boy, they're really, really cheap. Where are they now? They no longer exist. There's many, many features, many, many factors, many, many determining things on what is the most essential thing that we're going to do for sustainability. Price is only one thing. Okay? Ease of repair, the commonality of everything, the mechanics, ease of working. How fast can you get them fixed? Do we have the parts here? Brightbill is out there. I think they're in Lebanon. I said, we can get any part we need in a day. I don't know where the Thomas parts come from. I don't know where these other parts, are they easy to get? We want to have one type of bus to transport all the things that we need to do. Transport, as I pointed out at the work session, that logistical support is the most important thing. It works for FedEx, works for the U.S. military. How would you get to Afghanistan? Well, you have tremendous logistical support. I can get as many people as you possibly need in a matter of a day. That is your most critical thing. Then we can talk about bricks and mortar and everything. But this bus fleet, I'm telling you, needs to be replaced. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Patchell. Any other public comment this evening? All right, we'll move along with our agenda. Mr. Scrocky, which items do you want to take first? Would you like to take the department presentations first?
If we could, please. We have
Sure.
3 departmental budget presentations this evening, so if we could start with that. And actually, before we start, I heard some good news before this meeting started. I think it's important for the Finance Committee to hear it, that our student representative, Mr. Bill Wormuth, is actually accepted and will be attending Stanford University in the fall. So. I know that was a goal of Bill's since the time I met you about a year and a half ago, so congratulations to you. That's awesome news.
Congratulations, Bill.
Our first budget presentation tonight, I believe, is the HR budget. Dr. McHugh is going to be doing that presentation from the podium, and the PDF document has 3 parts that was attached in board docs. The first part is an executive summary. The second part is the slide deck that we have on the screen now, and the third part is the actual line-by-line detail of the budget. So Dr. McHugh is going to go through the slide deck. Thank you.
Mr. Scrocky. Thank you, members of the board and public, for your indulgence this evening to allow us to share the Human Resources Department budget. Obviously, our goal in HR is to recruit, hire, and retain the most highly qualified staff members and personnel to support the core mission of teaching and learning. I think I share that with you every year when we start this presentation. For us, our budget in human resources is approximately $4 million and is largely comprised of salaries, benefits, costs, and supportive services for various employee groups. Mr. Scrocky, the next slide. Thank you. As you can see on the slide, we're talking about object and function codes that primarily are distributed for our district substitutes. When we talk about that group of people, we're speaking to approximately 400 plus employees across the professional and support staff substitutes as employees. They would include our per diem substitutes, or the day-to-day, our long-term per diems, and our long-term support, or the LTS and support staff. Those placeholders that you see within our budget really are for expenditures that wind up becoming rerouted to other departments once those expenditures are seen at the building level by the substitutes who occupy those positions in our budget. So when we talk about salaries and more for HR, we are talking about, as I said a moment ago, recruiting, hiring and retaining, working with our staff through professional development, working with staff through movement and reacting and responding to the district's needs in terms of enrollment, employee support, as that might happen through our employee assistance program, working with employees on leaves of absence. The supervision and evaluation is monitored through human resources. As I indicated, all of our substitute needs, and then obviously the certification surrounding our employee groups, and then finally, and more recently, some of our college connections, which have afforded us the opportunity to create partnerships with neighboring and far-reaching colleges and universities where our students graduating from North Penn have demonstrated a knowledge and an interest in attending, so then creating those partnerships to hopefully bring them back to serve the district as they mature and have their degrees. So professional development, tuition reimbursement, column movement, employee relations, legal fees, and our recruit and hire functions, as well as our records management and storage for our employees in that last bullet on this slide, largely make up the human resources budget and the percentages of expenditures that you'll see within that budget. When we take a look at more depth into the HR budget, we have to look at staffing considerations. This is a collaborative process that is done through and with the departments and school leaders to evaluate our position responsibilities and the needs of each department. So as you can see, we take a thorough analysis of each position as the vacancies come about through resignations, retirements, and what we've done in more recent years is what we've called right-sizing the organization, taking a look at each position and is it truly needed in its current state? Can we streamline things? Are there other sharing of resources, pooling of resources? When we do that, we also take a comprehensive look at the job descriptions and create those revisions. So in doing that, we are streamlining our expenditures and our costs. We have been able to convert full-time positions to part-time positions with the use of increased technology, and that helps us to achieve our effectiveness and our efficiency goals. We, in recent years, as you look down through that slide, we have decreased the number of employees who are on our district medical plan. Over the last 8 years, that's been a concerted effort, along with right-sizing of departments and appropriately staffing departments for the demand and the need as we incorporate technology into our general workings of every day. So you can see that about 8 years ago, we were at 1,900 employees on the medical plans for the district. We now have approximately 1,583 at last count. But we do expect some increases in that due to the board's approval for the movement and the implementation of full-day kindergarten. So that might offset. The average cost in black, which is a little bit challenging to read on the large slide, but I believe on your computers you should be able to see them. Average cost of the medical insurance for an employee is about $14,000. When we look at the annual savings with those numbers that I represented above, we're looking at a savings of $4.4 million. And then over the course of those 8 years, we are in excess of $20 million with the decrease in the number of full-time employees on our medical benefits. So that's a cost realization and savings to the district. Again, just to highlight, full-day kindergarten implementation will cause us to reevaluate those numbers. And when we come back with a revised budget for next year, and we're projecting into the future, you'll see that play out as well. Tuition reimbursement is a large portion of what we take care of in HR, and you can see that for anyone who is in a bachelor's degree status, more of our newer employees working towards their first master's degree, we do reimburse that at 95% of the state university rate, which for this year winds up being about $490 to $500 per credit. And then for anyone moving into a pre-approved second master's degree, the doctoral program, some of the certification and endorsement programs that we offer, we do provide that at 62.5%. And that amount is about $322 a credit if you're looking at that. For administrators, we are reimbursing at about $870 a credit. And historically, I believe, Mr. Fusco, you asked the question last year, so I actually have it embedded in the information this year. About 24 staff members and 15 administrators have realized upward movement in new positions within the district as a result of our tuition reimbursement programs. When we look at our support staff, we've had about 138 support staff since 2014 who have experienced upward mobility. Some of our special education assistants, our intervention tutors and assistants now have teaching positions because they've gotten their certificates or their degrees in teaching, so they've moved into those positions. We did add, as a result of the newest collective bargaining agreement and negotiations, we did add the component of Pennsylvania recognized certifications and endorsement programs, and for that we've seen an uptick in interest in those areas where it best suits the needs of the district. And so we have, you'll see in our budget, increased that budgeting amount by about $84,000 due to what we've seen thus far in the year. Okay. Column movement is that parallel to tuition reimbursement, because as our staff are experiencing professional development and experiencing tuition reimbursement, they then have the opportunity one time per year to experience column movement across the scales to increase their earning potential and the salaries. So those again are provided for approved graduate level programs of certifications and endorsements. Random credits no longer contribute to column movement. Done very purposefully to increase the quality of the professional development and the programming that our staff are experiencing and engaged in for the best efforts and success of our students. Also slows the progression down for those legacy costs that we have in a salary way. And you'll see on the bottom of the slide, I have indicated that the realized savings over the course of the last 3 years, best calculated and estimated at $264,000, just excess of that. Okay. One of the additional remaining areas that I'd like to highlight this evening before we conclude is that of vendor contracts for human resources. A large part of our budget for vendor contracts is really attributed to the software and the technology utilization that we have in the department in order to streamline our efficiencies and really enhance the work that we do to support our personnel and our staff. So our contracts are typically negotiated with vendors to include in excess of 12 months of service when we can at the inception of the contract. So by that I mean we try to embrace and incorporate in the setup and the training costs. A prime example, if you recall, the board approved in a contract for us in November the changeover from Talent Ed to Frontline, which is our new source. It will be our new source provider for recruit and hire, and then has great potential for us to move to an electronic personnel records management resource. So for that, we actually started working with Frontline in December. Training for our staff has commenced. We'll go live in April or May, and our first bill will come due July 1st for the 1920 school year. So we've gotten in excess of about 6 months advanced opportunity to work within the system, train our staff, and move forward with that. So that's just one avenue that we've done with negotiating contracts to go far and above the general 12-month period of time. We almost always insist that they do not exceed the Act 1 index. Mr. Scrocky is very helpful in that realm with his connections and negotiating tactics. So from that venue, I can share with you a couple of our contracts that you'll see within the budget in the next pages. But we continue to work with PA REAP, and that's at $1,000 for our recruit and hire functions. I indicated to you Talent Ed would become Frontline. That's approximate cost of $28,000. And then we do subscribe to a diverse hiring and advertising posting site for $18,000. Then we also provide some of our professional development opportunities via online resources through Safe Schools, through consortium with the county schools across Montgomery County. That's at a cost of about $13,000. I mentioned early on in the presentation that we also provide employee support, and that is through Penn Foundation. They've been a long-standing partner of North Penn at an approximate cost of $24,000. That cost in the 5 years that I have been the director in Human Resources has not changed. And they do we continue to get quarterly reports with great satisfaction from our employees who either voluntarily seek the services or by those who are even mandated to attend due to performance issues. So we do see a high rate of success there. We also contract with LMG or Lansdale Medical Group for the physicals for our support staff employees, and that's a cost of about $8,000 per year. Our OASIS and MLP, which supports our supervision and evaluation online process that is seen in the buildings with our professional staff, is at approximately $16,400. And then lastly, our ASAP, which is our employee attendance and sub-coordination aspect, is approximately $28,000. That does have a slight increase over what we've seen in the budget in previous years because of this Insights platform and a consolidation of all frontline products. So we're estimating that there is a good chance that in a future rendition of the budget that might come down a little bit into like a $26,000 range. But sum total, there's an approximate of $120,000 in contracts, which is a slight increase over last year's budget in that particular category. Very wisely spent, I do believe, in terms of our electronic use of technology and the resources that it provides to streamline efforts across our department, and then how we eventually support the district staff and our administrative team. So, for example, one of the areas of curtailment that we've shared in the past is our recruit and hire process is completely online. You've experienced that. You've seen that. That has matriculated into an electronic interview process. So no longer are we printing hard copies of materials and things for our applicants. We're solely online, and that's made possible based on, our Google platform as well as that frontline software that will be in place. One area we continue to work on and highlight for you is that area of electronic onboarding, our orientation process, as well as then ultimately the goal is for electronic storage of personnel records and retrieval of that information. So I think through some of the efforts that I've shared with you, the lion's share of our budget, again, does remain in salaries and benefit costs for our employees. You've seen a highlight of a couple of the other areas that we do support, always, again, in supporting the effort of human resources and the personnel within the district. I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have as you look through that executive summary and or the slides that we just shared or the actual specific budget with its line items.
Thank you, Cheryl. I have a question. I have
Sure.
two questions, actually.
Okay.
The first is about the district's medical plan. When you said that it was a concerted effort to reduce the people on the plan? I'm just curious, to what do you attribute the fact that it has decreased so significantly over the last 8 years?
Yeah, I think, Mr. Fusco, that's a result of, again, some of the streamlining of our positions, part-time employment, opportunities of those natures that we've taken into consideration. We have some 5-hour shifts in our support staff that dovetail nicely with the 8-hour shifts, overlap some of the high-need areas without having a full 8-hour shift be put in place. Some of our support here in this building has been reduced to part-time employment. Sometimes we have employees who want to stay employed, but are seeking a partial contract. And so that benefits the district as well, because we'll wind up retaining the expertise that they share with us and the knowledge of the district, but in a part-time capacity, which then doesn't have that medical benefits attached to it. So those are some of the examples, but I think largely it is in right-sizing our departments, utilizing technology to a greater extent, and it has been done through attrition of staff. So when a staff member resigns or retires, we take an active look as to that position and how it can be dealt with moving forward. If we need to replace at a full 1.0, or can we reduce the effort and or disperse the responsibilities through technology among other individuals. So we haven't done a reduction in force, so to speak, or done it through a means that isn't more natural to what's happening within the organization.
Okay.
And Mr. Fusco, if I could just add one item to that. Back in 2014, in the fall of 2014, we did change our policy regarding eligibility for medical benefits.
Right.
It changed for new hires. I believe it was November 2014. Anyone hired from that point forward needed to work 30 hours a week in order to be eligible for medical benefits. Prior to that policy, the threshold was only 25 hours a week, and those employees were grandfathered in. So as those individuals leave, if we hire a 5-hour or 25-hour week individual to replace that individual, we're now bringing somebody on board that does not have eligibility for medical benefits, whereas their predecessor did.
Okay, very good. I'm glad that it's not disincentivizing people, essentially. The other second question was about tuition reimbursement.
Yes.
We have a very generous tuition reimbursement program in the district. And I'm curious, in terms of the way it's implemented, is there a cap in terms of the number of credits that teachers can take
Yes.
to enjoy that benefit? And what is that cap?
Yes, excellent question. We are capping with the first master's at 15 credits per year, and with the second master's is 12 credits per year. And then our administrative staff have a dollar amount cap.
Okay.
Great question, thank you.
Question,
Mr.
you
Prokowski.
tied in ASOP and
Yes.
Talent Ed, or Frontline.
Frontline is
Are they
the,
a member of, are they part of the same organization?
they are. The district, previous to this year, and I'd say within the last 8 to 12 months, perhaps, maybe a little bit longer, we've started to see Frontline move in and converge on some of the separate pieces. So we've had MLP, we've had OASIS, we've had ASOP. Frontline has come in and they are converging, bringing all of the pieces together on one common platform. It's called the Insights Platform, and so more of that will feed out. The beauty of it will be one sign-on for our staff members, so they no longer need to go to separate part and parcel modules in order to access their personnel information, and in order for the departments to be able to access that information on behalf of the employees or to help support what it is their needs are. So it will all be, there's a hope that it will be very streamlined and interconnected, and that's what Frontline is working towards as they've brought all the modules together.
Good.
That's why it made sense for us to move then from Talent Ed, which was a separate, anytime that we can decrease the number of times we're keying, entering, and/or uploading information into the database, the less margin for error and the more efficiencies that we have. Actually, also greater comfort for our employees in terms of their utilization of it as well. Another good question. Thank you.
I have a very basic question. Is North Penn part of the Montgomery County Consortium for School District Medical Plans?
Yeah, yes, but I'll let
Yes, we are. We're a member of a consortium called CPAS.
Right.
So we've been a member of that organization for a number of years now. So basically what we do is we own our own claims. So our claims are not shared with other school districts. We do pool our resources for reinsurance purposes. That's insurance that basically limits our liability on a particular claim. So we've been a member of that organization for medical and prescription, and your own Dr. Dietrich is also an executive member of CPAS as well.
If, as I become better educated, are there any standards or benchmarks? So when we look at it as percentage of the budget for your department, are there state standards? Maybe I haven't read one of the recent reports you've sent out, but just wondering how we are able to benchmark ourselves, if that's possible.
You know, what's really difficult with that is when we talk about departmental budgets, districts are across the board different with respect to what they include in a departmental budget compared to other districts. So we'd have to narrow that focus down a little bit more to core HR, it's called the accounting function,
Right.
to determine where we compare. We can certainly do that with a couple clicks of the mouse, but when we get into the overall department, that's a little more nebulous because some districts will include XYZ in a particular department, whereas other districts will include ABC in that particular department.
And understood, I certainly don't want to make you go through that exercise. I want to make sure that my role as a director, there isn't some information that I should be aware of, and I'm sure you would put it in this summary if it was. I do want to make sure we commend the administration, especially with your leadership, the energy that's been placed into making sure we're able to meet the needs of our students where they're at in the schools. We've added a lot of important positions that we've gotten positive feedback about dealing with mental health issues, while at the same time having an equal amount of energy into efficiencies and effectiveness and making sure that we have as tight as a budget as possible. I'm really happy to hear about the right sizing and that there's a methodology and process to that. And I think that comes out having the best return on investment for not only our taxpayers, but for the students then who are benefiting from these services. We're not simply holding the line. This isn't status quo budgeting. We're making sure we meet the needs of students, and just want to thank you for that, and I hope that we remain focused on that target moving forward.
We certainly try, Mr. Costa, and I give credit to all of our departments and to the directors and the leaders in the buildings because it is, as I said before, a very collaborative process when we start to talk about staffing and meeting needs of students. We do try. If you look back to last year, this presentation is very similar. The dollar amount is very similar. So in HR, we're trying to account for some of the movement, but overall, the budget, we try to maintain it at a similar or lower level from year to year. We move some of the categories around based on trends and data that we see. Certainly the tuition reimbursement and column movement is one area where, based on our negotiations and the CBAs, we've been able to adjust those. And that tends to help us keep things in line so that we can build in some of the other areas that we need.
I think as close as you've been at holding the line towards the prior year, that's fantastic. And as an example, I think, I don't want to gloss over when we talk about college connections. There is a need for us to have that, multidimensional need to have that type of resource. We met it, and, this is still fitting roughly within the budget of last year.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
For that, yeah.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Okay, our next presentation is the curriculum budget. The curriculum budget will be summarized by Dr. Rufo. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. The first slide that Mr. Scrocky has up there is the executive summary. And if you could just scroll down. What our priorities are for our curriculum budget for this year are really looking at several things. So obviously, first, curricular resources. So what do we need for our core content areas, math, English language arts, science and social studies, and also our specials and electives. Then we have our intervention programs and materials and resources, as well as our enrichment and AP classes. Full-day kindergarten and the implementation of full-day K, along with materials and professional development, is also something that you'll see highlighted in this budget. And then we also have a curriculum review cycle in North Penn, whereby different subjects undergo the curriculum review every 6 to 7 years. So you will see some new curriculum adoptions based on our examination of where the curriculum's at and if anything needs to be updated based on the standards. And then finally, another thing I would like to highlight tonight is really looking to invest in our internal capacity to deliver professional development rather than relying on external consultants. Okay, so that first slide just shows you roughly where all of the funds go. So our curriculum budget is about $5.6 million. The green and the pink segments of the pie graph there, the wages and then titles 2, 3, and 4, we pay for a lot of our salaries out of that. So administrator salaries in the curriculum department, as well as department chairs. That also includes any wages for teachers who are doing curriculum writing over the summer, stipends for inductees, any of that. And we do spend a portion of the grant funding from titles 2, 3, and 4 on that as well. The largest area there, the core instruction, as I had mentioned, those are the materials, the textbooks, the digital resources, the consumables that we need just for everyday instruction. And then the other pieces, the intervention and enrichment component figures into the next largest amount. We also have, as you can see, ESL services, interpretation. So we have the language line for our families that don't speak English. We need to communicate with parents. Also, sign language interpreters are included there. Professional development, our summer programs, which are our reading, math, and library and ESL. And then finally, the other category. So things like mileage within the district, or things that just don't neatly fit in those other categories. Okay, so when we're looking at our high impact expenditures, I tried to break it down for you into where the majority of the money is going within that 5.6 million. So the first amount is for the core curriculum materials and resources. Again, we're a learning organization, so the majority of the curriculum budget is dedicated to just that, to those everyday textbooks, workbooks, digital resources, things of that nature. Our intervention and enrichment materials, about $500,000 on that. Those include intervention programs like Read 180, math intervention. It also includes our enrichment and our AP resources and materials. And then finally, we spent about $367,000 on resources for our special areas. So at elementary, that would be library, art, PE, and music. And at secondary, also any electives that students participate in. Okay, so looking at full day K from a curriculum standpoint, we came in right around what we expected to. Initially, we were projecting about $500,000 in our FDK curriculum purchases. Our ELA and math, wrapping those together, comes to about $388,000, and then the PD that's associated with that, about $19,000. We did purchase will be purchasing some of our science materials this year, so that's going to remove that from this budget. Social studies, we have a new adoption coming up, so that cost will be wrapped into the new adoption, and then the special areas is also just wrapped into the general costs. For our new curriculum adoptions, the one that is the most significant is the adoption of a new elementary social studies curriculum and the curricular resource that's associated with it. So it's K through 6, so we're talking 7 grade levels, materials, textbooks, all of those things for all 7 grade levels. We will be working very closely with the business department once we have finalized a vendor and selected the best match for us to hopefully bring that cost down. So what that's based on was just our initial quotes that we received, kind of the midway point for 7 grades, but with the support of the business office, we do hope that that will be reduced. Our middle school science curriculum has also been updated for integrated science 7 and 8. We have a new ESL middle school curriculum. We're replacing some books that are quite old, and we're also adopting a new curricular resource for AP World History. The one thing that I'm excited about in terms of our curriculum department and where we're going with professional development is that something that's notably different, I think, from this budget than from past is that we're not relying on a lot of external consultants to come in and deliver professional development. And while I think that that's been helpful in the past to kickstart an initiative or give an initial overall keynote address, we really have a very talented staff within North Penn, and it's our belief and my belief that we need to develop those individuals we have and build our own capacity. So we will be using some consultants for the new adoptions and the things that are really curricular resource specific. But in terms of our own staff professional development, we're looking at doing a teacher leadership academy over the summer. And really we'll get double bang for our buck there because while there will be a small cost to pay the teachers to come in, we're not only training them in best practices, we can then use them as turnaround trainers. So if we were to have done all of that, based on the estimates we had with consultants last year, it would have been over $150,000. So that's something that we're looking forward to. And those are the major highlights. As you can see, the rest of the presentation is just line by line what each item is, so I'll open it up for questions.
Not so much a question, but to reinforce that last point about the consultants, I think that's great. The cost-benefit analysis that we're able to do, it's a natural progression. Multiple businesses that I've been involved with there's that sweet point or that sweet spot, and to be able to identify that now and we make that shift, very happy to hear about that, and just once again shows how much the administration is doing for efficiencies, but also effectiveness. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree completely. 20 years in teaching, I've often wondered why we spend so much money looking for people outside our districts when we have so much talent in-house. So kudos to us for moving in that direction. I'm curious about something relative to the review cycle and curricular material purchases. When we discussed at ECP the social studies curriculum, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was about 3 publishers, 3 vendors that we were looking
Correct.
to. Is that typical? Is that about what we generally have when we're looking for these major purchases?
Yes, because a lot of the publishing companies have merged, so there's just not as many choices that are out there right now.
And do they tend to be the same names as
They
well?
do. You
depending
tend to
on
see,
the-
HMH, McGraw-Hill.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about the cost of ESL interpretation. Those costs
Yes.
are very similar. And I know that the language access is an important issue to me. Those costs seem high relative to the actual teaching costs associated with ESL. And I'm just wondering if we've ever done analysis on who is accessing interpretation services and how. So I think that there are parents who are aware that they can ask for that or it's being used. And then also I think are we training staff on how to use telephonic interpretation to maximize the time, given that it is so costly?
Sure. Let me take that one segment at a
Yes.
time. So jump in if I miss something. So in terms of have we analyzed, who is accessing that? No, I don't think that we have. We do, when we use the language line, we do get a usage report. So that is something that I could look at in terms of historically what it has been. I do think that our staff is very well versed in terms of how to use it. We've been doing this for a while. I think that's why the costs are so high, because people are aware that it's a resource and we use it. And we do sometimes also have translators that come in, not necessarily through the language line. So that cost is in there also. What else? Missed something.
Does that cover just interpretation or translation too?
That's interpretation and translation. Good point. We don't get a ton of requests for translation, but what we do try to do is any major district communications. Last year, for instance, when we had the big changes in the law regarding immunization, that was something that was really important that we had in all of our top languages. So that's something that we try to be proactive about. And then if we have a specific request, then we would grant that.
Anybody else? All right, I think that's great. Thank
Okay,
you, Dr.
thank
Rufo.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Rufo. Our next presentation is Anne Marie Lucas, who is going to cover the Special Education Department budget. Welcome.
Good evening, members of the Finance Committee and the audience. So tonight, I'm going to present around the special education budget and also the student services budget for the district. And this is going to be a very brief presentation for what you will see is a very large budget, but it is encompassing many different areas. So on this first slide, you will see the breakdown of the budget itself. We are at $53,864,256 for the coming year. And personnel costs, as you've heard by others, is taking up a large part of the budget. And then instructional and service type supports are the other portion of things. When we talk about this budget, it includes special education, counseling services, nursing services, psychological services, homebound instruction, student assistance programming, mental health services, Section 504, Chapter 15, and also alternative education for disruptive youth. So there's a large amount of things that are encompassed within this budget. I want to stress that this budget does change with the ever-changing needs of our students, as well as their strengths. and that the goal is really to be visionary, collaborative, and student-focused and data-driven with this team and the entire district. I also want to remind the committee that there are many, many non-discretionary costs associated with this budget. In special education specifically, and it is a very underfunded mandate that we do a very good job of, making sure we have robust programming and services in place for students. And as we all know, there are a lot of legal ramifications around this budget as well, or around these services. So I wanted to just stress and point out some of the high impact expenditures that you may have seen from years past as well, and I just adjusted for this presentation. Out of district placement costs continue to come in at about I think it's at about a 0.5% increase for the coming year. And really, it's the cost of the increase in the tuitions and what they will run. Additionally, we have our Austal's contract for occupational therapy and physical therapy. We are anticipating another $100,000 that we'll need for next year for that, just as the increase in needs and services of students. But I do want to point out that Austal's has really remained quite stable with their cost to us over the years, so they're very competitive as well. Extended school year, the costs are going up by about 3.3% for next year. And really, it's not the in-district costs, it's those out-of-district costs that we're continuing to kind of monitor and see where they're coming in at. Those out-of-district costs are for the placements as well as related services, contracted related services that would be encompassed there. The autism discrete trial training is for applied behavioral analysis programming that is done both in the home for students as well as here in the school. We're really working on those parent training elements and ways in which we can foster those skills within the educational environment, but we are remaining very consistent as we were last year with this cost. And then I want to point out that the cost plan in Age of Beginners, you will see an increase in the current budget for these two areas. It is because IDEA, we're no longer splitting the cost. We used to split the cost with some of the IDEA funds. This year, it's all being assumed under the special education budget. So what those two items are, the cost plan includes our IU placements to exploration, some of the IU programs. It's also for vision, hearing, the audiometer calibrations, some of the mental health placements that we use with the IU, and very minimal assistive technology and also transition planning. Then the MCIU Age of Beginners, again, a cost we have no control over. These are funds where families decide to take the extra year in preschool, but we have to pay for those costs. I will say here that we are seeing a downward trend here in this cost because more families are opting to come into kindergarten as opposed to staying that extra year, so that's a positive. And then these last two costs are the contracted services with Northwestern Human Services, MIRK. They provide us with mandated student assistance programming, and we've kept that cost stable into next year. And then the Lakeside in-house counselors, this cost has gone up by one counselor, which was already presented to the board in a previous presentation. So major changes, I already mentioned on the last slide. There used to be that special education and IDEA fund split. Now we're taking IDEA funds and using them fully for salaries and benefits. So I wanted to point that out. And then a proposal to the board and the committee tonight is to look at, that's not in this budget, an increase in staffing request, going up by 7 additional equivalent full-time positions. And as you can see, I've listed out what those needs are. We're really in the related service area where we need some relief. The speech, gifted teachers and psychologists, the speech and gifted in particular, are at their state max almost for their caseloads, or they're hovering near. So we need to do something there to provide them some relief, specifically at the secondary areas. School psychologists are also, they're doing a lot of report writing, and we're finding that they're over their limit as far as what they can actually do for us. And the full day K, we're anticipating needs there with what the psychologists will have to provide for report writing and whatnot. And then the BCBA, we're currently at about 6.5 BCBAs, board certified behavior analysts across the district. The recommendation is to go up by one, again, as another proactive measure. Their role is really to be training, supporting the behavioral interventions with students and also with staff to help them be ready and able to support. In addition, as you've heard about school-wide positive behavior intervention support, having the BCBA is a part of that as we bring more teachers and more schools on to that framework. And then the middle school, the request is for 3 additional teachers there. We're seeing a large group of elementary students moving up into each building next year, and the needs there to cover those students, we need more case managers. In addition, the inclusion facilitator caseloads are getting rather large at the middle schools, making it more difficult for them to actually provide that coaching and training support to ensure those inclusive practices. So that's the recommendation or proposal for 7 additional staff. So, talked a lot about money we're spending. How are we looking at ways in which we can contain those costs or bring some monies back into the district? And really, a lot of that relies upon the ways in which we access our state and federal subsidies, as well as medical assistance, the reimbursements that we get there. So I've listed out here some of the funds to date that we have received, and we're bringing back into the district to, recoup what we've already talked about. The IDEA Part B funds is for school-age students, so that cost is listed there. Section 619 of IDEA, that's for kindergarten-age students. It's for that preschool age, and then we get these funds to use towards kindergarten students. And I really want to point out the access billing, because we've done a really phenomenal job with our child accounting teams in bringing in these funds that we use to offset some of the things like the Austal's OT and PT this year, as well as some other services and supports. So you can see the $750,000 to date, plus we got the additional $29,053 in administrative claims quarterly thus far. Contingency funds, that's something that the state, we apply every year, and every year we get the maximum allowable return on that. Those are for students with extraordinary service support needs. We were able to apply to get some of their tuitions or their needs paid for. And then we have students, 1306 students. They are students that are in institutions within the school district, but their parents reside outside of the school district. So what we do is we do a good job of trying to keep count of these students and then attributing those costs back to the home districts where the parents reside. So to date, we've been able to recoup those costs on that in a number of students. And we have the one facility Childway in the district, or a few of them actually. And then 4010 slots, so those are the Commonwealth-funded approved private school slots where a portion is reimbursed by the state and then the district assumes the rest of the cost. So to date, we've been able to bring back those amount of costs. So in summary of, moving forward, we continue to, from the last slide, look at the ways in which we can contain the cost by getting the most back on those state and federal subsidies, as well as with the medical assistance reimbursement. And then I just wanted to highlight these different bullet point areas that we're continuing to kind of look at and do a really good job in, but how can we maximize things further? So really looking at our out-of-district placements and programs and, least restrictive environment for those students and when we might be able to build programs within the district to support their needs. We're always looking and talking with our vendors and contractors to get, the best rate possible, or seeing how we might be able to do it ourselves if possible. And we already have a very, very robust early intervention process of bringing our students in. But here what I'm talking about is really we want to look at the full day kindergarten and the impact it has on our referral process, our multiple tiered systems of support moving forward. The in-district transition services are very, very strong as well, but we have some students that are still accessing out-of-district transition services, so how can we balance that? And I know we've talked about this, or the board's talked about this, the mental health and social emotional needs, and really looking over time at what we're seeing from that school-wide positive behavior intervention supports framework and how it is impacting the services we're providing here in district. And then extended school year, again, we're really looking at our in-district programming is very solid and strong, and what does it look like out of district and how we can enhance things there. And that's about it. So I know it's a rather large budget. I look forward to future collaborations with this committee and the rest of the board, and I will entertain any questions that you might have.
Steve, why don't we, the component that relates to the staffing request, why don't we schedule an exec session of the Finance Committee, either before or after our next meeting next week, to have a personnel discussion, the personnel implications of that proposal, and then we'll, if the group can limit their questions and comments to the non-personnel items of this presentation, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Good.
Thank you for, as you said, it's a lot to cover. But, I appreciate that it was concise as well as informative. So I'll start just with impressions, and then, separate to that, I have a couple questions. But I'd like to spread it around first. The impression overall, what I like about finance is when we see something come together, and especially it's important having the cameras here tonight and the ability for more public accountability and transparency. How often has everyone heard it, right, all the catchphrases in the public the last year? Holistic programming, what it means about mental health, all these different terms. This is where it comes together, because what I'm hearing is the administration adding it up so that it's going to reduce those alternative placements, reduce the time. I mean, that's a major spend. I used to be on the other side of that decades ago, providing the alternative placements in education. And there's a lot of money that is spent by a school district on that. And when we have full day kindergarten starting at the beginning, we're, socially, we're balancing that checkbook, so to speak, and getting it right with those interventions. PBIS, the enhanced in-district services, and as we're trying to move away from consultants, multiple levels here, you're creating the efficiencies that's actually going to, this is why we don't see, the budgets will always go up. We're not wasting our money, and it's student-centered while still getting the most for a taxpayer. And perhaps I'm a bit nerdy on these things, but this is really exciting, seeing the programming driven by being student-centric also serve the taxpayer and to get the best return on investment. So thank you for that. That's my one soapbox. The question I have about the BCBAs, how are they broken down across the different levels? Is there a particular split? And to that end, if we're adding any, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to get into the current 7, but I just want to understand how the BCBAs are deployed, so to speak.
They are split across the different elementary and secondary centers. I'm not quite sure exactly what goes into that, but I'm pretty, they're looking at student needs and whatnot. We have a lead BCBA as well, who's kind of taking the hold on programming across the district, but I can look into that further, exactly how it's all delineated.
I think that'll just help in our decision-making process and other deliberations, not questioning the BCBAs, but so that we have a better understanding of, well, if we're adding them, what does it mean to the overall strategy?
And the request comes from the fact that they're pulled right now to do a whole lot with training and just on-the-spot de-escalation and support with students. As far as report writing goes, they're the ones who are helping with the development of the functional behavioral assessments, the positive behavior support plans. They really take the lead with different team members on that. So they also have a hand in a lot of the compliance paperwork we have to do. And then as school-wide positive behavior rolls out, we're really looking at potentially 4 more schools joining next year, and their role is integral to get that. So how we can balance sending them to consortium for 4 days out of the year, as well as getting to the other things, that's where the request was kind of coming from.
Thank you. And I think that would help towards what Mr. Diazio was mentioning as well, and that the board agreed upon for, a different session. But having some of that data, I would like to, I have no doubt that the BCBA's have a great value to their schools and the district. My assumption is we might be blown away by the numbers as to how many interventions or what it really means. Once again, that'll inform, right, as we set policy and strategy going forward. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Most of my questions really revolve around personnel, although I would like to point out, and for clarification, the $2.2 million, the IDEA funds, that is the total amount that we're receiving through the IDEA?
Yes. That's our allotment based on the data that we share with them for PIMS and other things,
All right, just to point out in the context of budgets, that is probably significantly less than what the law really should, in and of its own language, mandate for spending for special education expenses for our district. That number seems to fall short. I know it's not 40% of our total budget for special ed, but 2.2 million is a small number compared to the mandates that are placed on us. So.
When IDEA came out, it was supposed to be 40% funded, and I think we've not seen anywhere near that.
We've
I
not
think most
seen
districts see
20%,
exactly, but that was the original intent of the law, was at least to see some of that percentage to come in. But
Right, just
that
to
has not
highlight your
happened.
point about those unfunded mandates and kudos to the job that we do here and to meet the needs of our students in this district, because we do, and we do a phenomenal job of that. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to defer. So you mentioned nurses, and are we just holding the line now on nurses? How is that right now for our district, standard-wise?
So I will have to, Dr. Kyle Hassler and I kind of work through this budget together, and his oversight is with nursing and counseling. So at this time, I don't want to speak for him, but I believe it stayed static. Yeah, but I can look into that. Further.
Yeah, it is. We're within the range. I mean, we're close. It's quite a large ratio. It's about 1 to 1,500 for nurses. It's not really reasonable to just have 1 to 1,500, which is why we kind of balance that out with the staff nurses. So at this point, it is status quo.
Thank you.
We do thank the three administrators for their presentations this evening.
Thank you.
Steve's going to be talking in just a minute about various cost drivers. We know there are mandates. Certainly you can see in the special education budget, if you scroll to the very, very, very bottom there, we were at $49,605,969 last year. That's our budget in our present year, if you want to call it that. Next year's budget up to $53,864,256. So you're seeing $4.25 million increase in special education. So we'll see that when we look at the various cost drivers in our budget. But very mandate-heavy department within our school district, and of course, meeting the needs of children, complex needs.
All right, I think that puts us back on track here. We'll go back up to the items recommended for work session or action meeting. We'll start with the budget presentation.
Good evening, everyone.
Good
evening,
Steve.
I'm also very excited that this Finance Committee meeting is being televised tonight because it's my son's 21st birthday today, so happy birthday, Brody Scrocky. I know he will watch this because about 2.5 years ago, Brody and I were hiking in Acadia National Park, and Dr. Dietrich happened to be at Acadia at the same time. You might recall this, Dr. Dietrich, correct? So Brody and Dr. Dietrich went off and did a hike on their own the one day because I was too scared to climb some of those cliffs. And I know part of the conversation was board governance. We were talking about school board governance. And since that time, 2.5 years ago, Brody's been very interested in watching the North Penn school board meetings. So he'll be able to watch tonight's Finance Committee meeting on his 21st birthday. So as soon as it's posted live on YouTube by Mr. Gilmer, I'm sure he'll be watching it online. But thanks to Dr. Dietrich, Brody Scrocky has an interest in board governance now. Anyway, and I'm sure he enjoys your comments, Mr. Patchell. He quite often mentions that to me. He enjoys your commentary. Okay, so tonight, I'd like to give a very brief overview on the status, the first draft of our 2019-20 budget, trying to keep things to a 10,000-foot overview and talk about some of the major drivers of the budget and just basically where we're at right now with the budget. Now, next week, we'll talk in more detail because we have the preliminary budget adoption scheduled for next Tuesday night at the board work session. So tonight is kind of a preview presentation, and then next Tuesday I'll actually get into more detail. So 4 takeaways from tonight. If you can leave tonight with these 4 thoughts in your mind, tonight's presentation will be a success. First off, this is very early in the budget process. With the Act 1 requirements that we have and the timelines and so forth, the budget process starts earlier and earlier every year. This process started back in November 2018. And when you start that early, that far away from the fiscal year, a lot of information is very tentative. This is no different. You'll see tonight that we have a very challenging budget in front of us for the 19-20 year. And as we always do with the first draft of the budget, we feel this is a worst-case scenario. So some of the numbers you'll see tonight are quite staggering, but we do believe that things will get better from this point because as we're making a number of estimates, we try to be very conservative with a number of our estimates. And also, you've heard me talk quite a bit about how our budgets are getting tighter and tighter and tighter. I'll demonstrate that with a couple slides on that in a moment. So just a quick refresher, our budget is a 3-step process. We have a preliminary budget, a proposed final budget, and a final budget. So we're really in step 1 of 3 for the 19-20 budget. So tonight is the first draft presentation, and as I mentioned, we'll be asking for the board's approval next Tuesday, February 12th, of the preliminary budget, and also for the board to consider application for referendum exceptions. May 16th is the second phase of the 3-step process. We'll be asking the board to adopt the proposed final budget on May 12th at the board action meeting. And then finally on June 20th, we'll be asking for the board to approve the final budget. So just another refresher on some of the terms we'll talk about tonight. We'll talk about what a balanced budget is, what a deficit budget is, and what a surplus budget is. So a balanced budget is simply when revenues equal expenditures. And that can happen with a tax increase, that can happen through cuts, that can happen through a variety of ways. This year, for example, we do not have a balanced budget in this current fiscal year. We have approximately a $2.7 million deficit. So what's a deficit budget? A deficit budget is simply when expenditures are higher than revenues. So again, our expenses for the current year, the 18-19 fiscal year, are $2.7 million higher than the revenues. And a surplus budget, that's a dream budget, that's when revenues are higher than expenditures. So I would love to see the day where we can return to a surplus budget, but quite honestly, it may not be in the cards for a number of years. Everything I'll present tonight assumes a 0% tax increase. So we are starting with a 0 increase as the basis, using the same millage rate or tax rate as we have now. And then we'll talk about various tax scenarios if the board would consider a tax increase. So with a 0% tax increase, the first draft of our budget has us at a $14.1 million deficit budget. Again, that means that expenditures are higher than revenues for the upcoming year, $14.1 million. So that's a pretty large number. There's no question about it. We'll talk about some of the major drivers of that and how that deficit can be brought down, but that's where we stand right now, $14.1 million. So in order to get that balanced budget, revenues equal expenses, we would need to raise taxes by 7.86%. As things stand now, again, more revenues might become available. There might be some expenditures that are reduced or refined, but right now as we stand, to balance this budget would be a 7.86% increase. Now, that's an impossibility. Why is that? Act 1 of 2006, as many of you know, limits the school district's ability to raise taxes in any given year. So with Act 1 restrictions for the 1920 year, our base Act 1 index is 2.3%, meaning that the maximum tax increase for North Penn School District would be 2.3%. Now, there are some exceptions that would be available, and I'll talk about what exceptions mean in a moment. But again, to balance a budget, 2.86%. So to break down our budget real quickly between revenues and expenses, our expenses would be $275.7 million under this first draft budget. And expenses only $261.6 million. And that's where we get our $14.1 million deficit. Expenses right now are 5.93% higher than they are in the current year. And revenues, 1.59% increase. That revenue figure is a really important number, I believe. Again, that's with a 0% tax increase. I just mentioned earlier that our Act 1 index for the upcoming year is 2.3%. That 1.59% in revenues is what I would call our organic growth. How much are our other revenues increasing in the district outside of a tax increase? And our revenues, our organic growth, isn't keeping up with the Act 1 index. So right away, you're starting out the year in a major hole, even if everything else was equal in terms of expenditures. So our revenues aren't keeping up with the Act 1 index. 1.59% is a pretty low number for a couple of reasons. I'll talk about some of them a little bit later. But again, I think that's a really important metric, that our revenues, our natural organic growth, is not keeping up with the Act 1 index. In that Act 1 index, we have the historical information on this chart showing where it started out in 2006-07. Act 1 index is somewhat of an inflationary index, but it's a lagging index. It's based on historical data. It's not based on forward-looking data. So 2.3% for the upcoming year. Now, the Independent Fiscal Office, which is an independent office in state government, Pennsylvania state government, does do a forecast for future years. And they do have the index slated for the 2021 year at 2.8%, rising to 3.4% in the 22-23 year. Their projections in the past, I do need to let you know, have been overly optimistic. Overly optimistic. For example, this year their projection was about 2.7%, and it came in at 2.3%. And that's been the case the past couple of years. Their projections are typically higher than what the actual number ends up being. So I mentioned earlier that there's a thing called exceptions to the Act 1 index of 2.3%. North Penn School District is actually eligible for two exceptions. The first one is special education, roughly a $1.6 million exception. And that is really taking a look at our historical cost over a 2-year period, and if those costs are rising in excess of the Act 1 index, you're eligible for that dollar difference, and it comes out to roughly $1.6 million. On the retirement front, an exception would be available for $48,000, a pretty paltry number, and the reason for that is the retirement rate increase this coming year is just barely over the Act 1 index. I think it's about 2.57%. So that only yields a small retirement exception possibility. So adding the two together, that would yield an additional, in terms of taxes, that potentially could yield an additional 0.89% in terms of a tax increase, meaning that if the board would decide to apply for, receive, and use the exceptions, the maximum tax increase would be 3.19%. Now, just a preview for next Tuesday, our administrative recommendation would be to apply for the exceptions to the Pennsylvania Department of Education. That doesn't mean the board needs to use the exceptions. However, if you don't apply for the exceptions, you never can use them. So we feel for added flexibility as we move forward, march forward towards the final budget, at least that's something for debate, discussion, and part of the board's deliberation with the final budget. So we will be recommending applying for the exceptions next Tuesday at the board work session. So I mentioned one of the takeaways earlier is to talk about the budget variances and a tighter budget, a tighter and tighter budget. And it's a really important point because many times we hear a comment, I'll use this year for example, we have a $2.7 million budget deficit. So I've heard a comment that, well, we have a budget deficit, but we know at the end of the year we're going to end up with a surplus, right? Well, that has typically been true the past several years. That we typically have had budget deficits, but at the end of the year, because of reduced spending and more revenue that's being brought in than what we budgeted for, we end up the year in a surplus situation many times. However, that gap has started to narrow and narrow and narrow, as one of our goals is to refine the budget to the point where we're reducing our variance. And our variance is simply this. It's the difference between our budgeted revenue and expenditures and our final audited revenue budget, or final revenue and expenditures as part of the audit. So I went back to 9-10 and looked at, on the expenditure side, what those variances were. And you can see back then they were about 6%. In the 17-18 fiscal year, they were about 0.6% for the 17-18 fiscal year. So they've decreased year after year, and I think this provides the data and demonstrates pretty clearly that our budget is getting tighter. So when we say we have a budget deficit when we start the year, there's going to be a point, and I think the 19-20 year is the point where we'll have a budget deficit, and at the end of the year, we will have an actual deficit when we close out the year. And I'll show you a slide on that a little bit later. So I broke down in 5-year increments before SS, that's Steve Scrocky, for those of you who might be guessing, before SS and after SS. I was going to put an acronym BSS for before Steve Scrocky, but then I had a problem for the acronym for after SS. That wouldn't work for this presentation. So I left it at before and after SS. So the 5 years before Scrocky was at North Penn, the variances were roughly 4.5%. And I clearly stated to the board back in 2014 when I came to North Penn that one of my goals was to reduce that budget variance. So the 5 years since I've been here, the average over that 5-year period in the expenditure side has been about 1.5%. So I mentioned at last week's, I think it was the Support Services Committee, or the committee formerly known as the Support Services Committee, now known as the Facilities and Operations Committee, that our goal this year for the 19-20 year is to get to a 0.5% variance for the upcoming year, 0.5%. So the last 5 years has been 1.5%. We scored 98.5% on our exam, and we want to score 99.5% on our exam in the coming year. On the revenue side of the equation, we've had some ups and downs in the variances. In the 10-11 year, for example, there was a situation that I don't think any board wants to encounter. Fewer revenues were brought in that particular year than what was budgeted. That's a really bad situation. I kind of equate that to a publicly traded company that has a release of their quarterly earnings and they come in shy of analysts' expectations. What happens to the stock price when they come in shy of analysts' expectations? The stock price gets hammered, right? In this particular case, if a board or a business manager has a revenue budget and it comes in under the budget at the end of the year when you have your final numbers, both entities, the business manager and the board, will get hammered. So to some extent, when you're dealing with revenues, being conservative is a good thing. It's part of managing expectations. Just as public companies do, they manage analysts' expectations with respect to earnings. Budget development is similar to managing expectations. So we try to be conservative, that's true, but in the upcoming years, I think we need to be less and less conservative, but that's walking a fine line.
And it's really challenging. We do really appreciate the work the business manager has done in this regard, but as a person who was here during that time period, to be able to predict the national economy, and we saw that coming, so I recall very distinctly in 9-10 and 10-11 there, some of the things that were referenced with Dr. McHugh's presentation earlier this evening with, getting people off of the medical plans and living with vacancies and not replacing people because we saw those revenues that were coming in. Particularly, we saw it coming in 9-10 and then really realized it in 10-11 when we saw the impact, for example, of those that were appealing their assessments and that sort of thing. We saw a dramatic reduction with our other sources of income coming in. So with those two, the confluence of those two things, some really difficult things were done during that time period. So despite our best efforts to try to project revenues, the national economy was not doing well during that time period. And again, it's one of the things that does make it difficult moving forward also when you try to do those predictions on what was necessary. But there was extreme budget belt tightening during 9-10 and 10-11 with not replacing people And that was a time period we saw a dramatic reduction in the number of people on the medical plan. You saw those numbers earlier this evening.
Okay, so again, this takeaway is the budget is becoming tighter. That's been the trend over the past couple of years. So it's going to be increasingly difficult if we have a final deficit budget to be able to move that deficit into a surplus situation for the 1920 year. It's going to be very challenging. So when we do have deficit budgets, one of the ways a deficit budget is funded is through the use of reserves. For a school district, those reserves are known as a fund balance, and our audited fund balances appear on the chart now. It's broken into 4 categories. Probably the most important one is the unassigned fund balance. That can be used for any purposes designated by the school district, $20.7 million in our unassigned fund balance. Now, by law, we cannot have an unassigned fund balance higher than 8% of our budgeted expenditures for the upcoming year. We're slightly under that at 7.96%. We still have money committed for pension obligations, $16.8 million, and we drew on some of that this past fiscal year. Also, we have $2.7 million for our self-insured medical and prescription program. So $40.9 million. It's a healthy fund balance. We've talked about this before. It's the primary reason why the school district has a AA1 bond rating through Moody's. This is the primary reason. When we're on those rating calls with Moody's, the first question talks about fund balance. So they have a formula, they have a metric that determines what your rating will be, but the highest percentage boils down to where is your fund balance and how much money do you have in capital reserve. And in terms of the classifications, quite honestly, Moody's could care less about the classifications because by board resolution, any of the classifications, with the except for the inventory and prepaid items, the board can move these categories around by board resolution, just like that. So when we talk about fund balance, it's probably just safe to talk about the total fund balance. $40.9 million, including some of our inventory and prepaid items. And the categories, to me, just aren't as important as the total. In terms of our unassigned, though, that has kind of tapered off over the past couple of years. The board did an excellent job over the years of increasing the unassigned fund balance, which did result in that bond rating upgrade about a year ago, but it now is pretty much leveled off. So let's talk about some of the major highlights for the 1920 budget again in this first draft. We have some good things, we have some challenging things. So some of the good first. We do have an expiration of a technology lease that's coming off our books. So $1.4 million is off the books and not included in this budget. This budget does not reflect any retirements. And history tells us that we can count on about $1 million worth of retirements between now and May. Also, the retirement rate, only a 2.57% increase in the upcoming year. That's the lowest increase in 10 years. So that's good news. Our retirement expense is still pretty darn high, but in terms of the rate of increase, well, I'll take a 2.57% compared to some of the previous years. Also, some positive elements. I mentioned a month or two ago about our healthcare first look rates of $464,000 increase. That's about a 2% increase. That's a pretty low increase. Now, that's just for our existing staff. That doesn't include any additional health care as a result of some new staffing that we have on the books for 1920 year. But that's a very good number. $464,000 increase is a very low number. We mentioned earlier about our natural organic growth, and there's 3 areas here. EIT is the earned income tax. Second is the realty transfer tax. That's a tax that we receive 0.5% every time a property sells in North Penn School District. And the final one is investment income. Those 3 categories alone are resulting in a $1.35 million increase in our revenues for the upcoming year. And I do need to mention that all 3 of those, let me start with the EIT and transfer tax. Those budget figures for EIT and transfer tax are at an all-time high for the upcoming year, and the investment income is at a 12-year high in terms of budget. Okay, so again, we're being less conservative and we're furthering our projections in those 3 areas and adding that revenue to the budget. Also, we are planning on purchasing at least 10 buses again for next year. We have $1 million on the expenditure side for the purchase of 10 propane buses next year. But this year now, since we already received 1 grant and we're hopeful to receive more of these grants, we're offsetting that by an anticipated $500,000 grant through the PA Driving Forward program. So we did add $500,000 to revenue to offset the bus purchases for the upcoming year. So a couple unknowns. We have state funding and federal funding. We have no idea where they're going to be, but we put 2% in for budget purposes. If any of you are available tomorrow, starting at high noon, the governor will be presenting his 2019 state budget. That address will be streamed live. I'll be watching it tomorrow. You're welcome to come in and join me to watch that. We'll get our first glimpse in terms of what the governor is proposing for state funding for us for the upcoming year, in particular for the basic instructional subsidy and for special education subsidy. For now, we put 2% in the budget. When we get those revised numbers, that will be part of our many iterations of the budget. We will update those figures. Also, I mentioned that we don't know about retirements for the upcoming year, but we can pretty much count on $1 million. We heard tonight about some potential staffing changes, some additional staffing increases beyond full-day kindergarten. Full-day kindergarten is baked into these numbers. And workers' compensation is another area that we have no information on yet. So a couple of the financial challenges. I mentioned last week at the Facilities and Operations meeting, we have a 10-year plan for facilities and operations. And the question becomes, how do we start funding the plan? The plan calls for roughly $3 million a year, each year for the next 5 years for capital improvements in our school district, outside of renovation and construction projects. So the way the capital plan has been funded in the past is if we had money left over at the end of the year, we came in under budget on expenses, we transferred money to the capital reserve fund. So we felt to be more proactive, again, because as the budget gets tighter and tighter, that means less and less money might be available to transfer to the capital reserve fund. We felt it was important to start funding the 10-year capital plan. And this is a first step. We have $500,000 in the 1920 budget to fund that long-term capital plan. So that still falls well short of the $3 million average per year, but it's a start. We'll take this and we'll look at the highest priority items and hopefully work from here. The retirement increase, although only a 2.57% increase in terms of real dollars, it results in a $3.3 million increase to our expenditure budget. Now, keep in mind, retirement expenditures are offset through a subsidy through the Department of Education. It's a 50% subsidy. So our net increase would be half of that $3.3 million. One concerning point for the upcoming year is our tax base. Okay, that's the assessed value for all properties in North Penn School District added up together. That equals your tax base. Our tax base for the upcoming year is only increasing 0.13%. That's a pretty low number. In fact, with my 5-year financial projections that we share with the board over the past couple of years, we typically project a 0.5% increase. So for the upcoming year, right now, as we stand through the end of January, that tax base is only going up 0.13%. So why is that? A couple of reasons. Number one, we have a district that is, especially from a commercial perspective, is pretty well built out. We're not seeing any large commercial developments occurring in our school district. Secondly, we have seen an uptick in terms of property owner-initiated tax assessment appeals in this past year. I mentioned about some of those in a previous Finance Committee meeting last fall, but we are seeing an uptick, and I can tell you that we do have several large parcels that are in the pipeline that there's no question in my mind will result in further reduction and further erosion of the tax base. So that's clearly a major challenge that we'll be facing. And with our current tax rate, our current millage rate as it's known, that 0.13% increase only results in a $242,000 increase in revenue. Okay, so again, comparing that to the Act 1 increase, it's only 0.13% if taxes aren't increased. That doesn't keep up with what's more than 2.3% increase on our expenditures. So that's a pretty concerning number. Now, we do get updates every month from the county. New properties come on the roll. There could be subdivision, new developments, improvements to the property. Those are called interims. As we receive that information, we continuously update the tax base to reflect updated figures for our budget. Salary increases for the upcoming year, including our new positions that we have in right now, resulted in a $4.8 million increase in expenses. Charter school tuition up $500,000, based not only on the increase in tuition, but based on increased enrollments. And new debt, We'll talk later tonight about our 2019 bond issue, but we also had an issue in late 2018. That debt starts to be paid off with the 1920 fiscal year, and that was $1 million added to the budget. So you've heard me talk about the retirement rate many, many times before. So again, this chart just illustrates the exponential increase, what's happened from 2001-2 up to the projected 25-26 year. It's staggering, the increase. Back in 2001-2, the retirement rate was about 1%. Next year, it's over 34%. So it's in a mere 17 years, we've gone from 1% to over 34%. And that cost is absorbed in the budget. So we're at about $44 million of our $275 million budget comes from retirement. And it continues to eat up a larger and larger percent of our total budget. So for the upcoming year, about 17% of our total budget on the expenditure side will come from retirement expense, 17%. And 7 years ago, it was about 3.5%. So 3.5% of the budget up to 17% of the budget in 8 or 9 years. Again, a staggering figure. So I just want to start to conclude the presentation by talking about one potential scenario. We threw around a number of these scenarios last year to kind of put things in perspective, where we are now and possibly where we might be at the end of this budget process, or where we might be actually at the end of the 1920 fiscal year. So this first draft of the budget, again, has a $14.1 million deficit. So we're going to add some things that we can potentially anticipate for your consideration. First off, if the board would increase the revenue through an Act 1 tax increase, that would generate $4.1 million. So we're going to lower that deficit. Each one of these items is going to lower that deficit. I mentioned earlier about anticipated retirements, $1 million. We have $1.5 million in the budget per board policy for budgetary reserve. And budgetary reserve is basically a contingency that's in the budget. It's not allocated for any particular purpose. It's a contingency in the budget. So many times that budgetary reserve doesn't get spent at all. So when we mentioned about variances before, if we took out that budgetary reserve, our variances on the expenditure side would be even smaller. That slide I showed you before included the budgetary reserve. It did not include transfers of the capital reserve fund, but included budgetary reserve. So again, many times, unless there's some catastrophic situation in the district, that budgetary reserve really doesn't get touched. So if we reach our goal next year and have variances of 0.5% on the revenue side and the expenditure side, that would yield an additional $2.6 million to the budget. So if we hit that target, $2.6 million. Throw that all into the mix based on where we're at right now with the budget. That would mean at the end of the 1920 fiscal year, we would have a deficit of $4.8 million. And how would that be made up? That would come from fund balance. That could come from the amount that's designated or committed for PSERS, or that could come from the unassigned fund balance. Again, from my perspective, it doesn't matter. The fund balance is the fund balance is the fund balance. But that's where we're at now. It would be roughly a $4.8 million deficit. So I want to go back to the point that I made earlier, that we hear the argument many times, well, you tell us that you have a deficit budget to start out, but we'll take that with a grain of salt because at the end of the year, we always end up with a surplus. Well, under the current situation, that wouldn't be the case. The current situation is telling us that we'll probably be looking at a $4.8 million actual deficit at the end of the year. Now, will that $4.8 million come down? Maybe. If we're presenting a worst-case scenario of the budget tonight, it probably will. It probably will, because we have a lot more work to do. One of the takeaways from tonight is we're in the early stages. This is really just the beginning. True definition of preliminary. This is the beginning. Over the next 3-4 months, we will scrutinize every line item in the budget. I forget the last count, 10,000 plus line items in the budget. We go through, believe it or not, every line item in the budget. We've had over 25 budget meetings already with building principals and department administrators. We'll continue to go back and refine as needed. But as we stand now, worst case scenario, even factoring in some of these positive variances, we could end the year with a pretty large deficit. So a couple tax scenarios. This might be a familiar chart from last year at various tax increases, what it does to the deficit and what it would do to the average homeowner. I'll focus on two. The 2.3%, again, that's the Act 1 index. that would leave us with a $9.9 million deficit as we stand now. The average homestead in North Penn School District, the average homestead is roughly $145,000 in assessed value. That would result in an $87 increase. 3.19%, the last increase there, that would be if the board applied, received, and used both the special education and retirement exception. In that case, that would reduce the deficit to $8.4 million. The average homeowner would have a $121 increase. And then there's other various iterations that we could do in between. So our next steps include, as I mentioned, a line item review of all revenues and expenses. We'll update the budget as new information comes in, especially with the governor's budget address tomorrow. We'll have further discussion about the PSERS rate stabilization fund and should money be pulled from that segment of the fund balance. We'll talk about staffing recommendations in the upcoming months, and we'll really get into the 5-year projections again. 5-year projections are really going to be important, especially as we start deliberating and having consideration about potential additional borrowing for future renovation and construction projects. Very important tie-in to that concept of new debt issuance as well. So again, tonight was meant to be a preview of next Tuesday night. I'll get in a little more of data next Tuesday night, show some additional benchmarking information next week, but at least this gives you a taste for what we're looking at for our first draft of the budget.
Questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Skoraki, for the overview. I look forward to those details next week. A couple just questions so I can become educated. So how many times in the past 5 years, or if we're going pre-Steve, Skoraki, how many times was full Act 1 utilized by the district? Or thereabouts?
Thereabouts. So the history of North Penn School District since the passage of Act 1 in 2006, there were some years where the Act 1 index was not even reached. There were years but 1 year, with the exception of 1 year, where the district applied for the Act 1 exceptions and didn't use them. Okay, the Act 1 exceptions were used 1 year, and there was also 1 year where the board passed a resolution saying that we're not even going to apply for the Act 1 exceptions. But to a large degree, over the past 10, 12 years, the Act 1 index has been utilized as a tax increase to a large degree.
To its fullest, most of the time?
Not to the fullest, to the Act 1 indexed, not with the exceptions. There was only 1 year where exceptions were used.
And that's what I wanted to make sure. Without the exception, though, whatever that number was, did they always max it out to 100% of that, or was it typically less?
I would say that the majority was up to the Act 1 index.
Okay.
There were some years that were less, but most years were at the Act 1 index.
So, and that's helping, and thanks for sticking with my line of inquiry here. I think it's important to know for the public what the typical rate of increase has been, so that we're able to have some context to what this means and the current environment as it relates to our past, to understand the decisions for the future. You know, as my fellow colleagues know, it was a very tough decision, but I felt it was responsible to vote for the exception in our prior year because I voted for some programs I really believed in, like full-day kindergarten. You know, it's one thing to vote for what you want. It takes some guts to then fund it. And so it's interesting that I remember as part of our work session last budget that, you know, if we had baked in just an average of, say, 0.5% average over the last 5 years, we'd already be at about $7 to $8 million in our budget without raising a single tax this year. Is that a correct understanding?
That's correct. The cumulative effect that when taxes are increased or not increased, that rolls over year after year after year. It has a cumulative effect, correct.
So, and that's what I want to make sure then in validating those assumptions, that those are the facts, as we pivot now to modernizing what we do at support services. And for those who attended or were able to view that session last week, it was a very important shift that if I leave tomorrow and, you know, go to Costa Rica and never come back, then at least I'll be very happy knowing that a 10-year plan is being put in place. And I think it's important for the board and the community realizing as we look at this, 10 years of planning hasn't been done before in the terms of our aging of our facilities and what we need to do to have a placeholder in order to afford that. That goes to my other, and one of the last questions. For Moody's, and I wanted to make sure I heard this correct last week, I know how important it is for us to get 99.5%. Did I hear correctly that the closer you get, that also preserves your bond rating as well with your projection? Is that part of it?
Well, actually, Moody's has a comment that was on our report that we received for the most recent bond issue. And Moody's actually likes very conservative budgeting. So actually, their preference would be not 99.5%. They'd rather see 97%. So they like the conservative, very conservative budgeting. And again, I equate that to the analyst expectations. It's kind of like under-promise, over-deliver, the UPOT approach. Under-promise, over-deliver. Analysts like that, Moody's likes that. So one of the challenges moving forward, I think, is kind of an unintended consequence, perhaps, as we get tighter with the budget and those variances shrink, that might shift Moody's commentary, because that was actually listed and called out as a positive commentary that the school district engages in conservative budgeting. So if that component is stripped out and we're at 99.5% actual compared to budget, that doesn't demonstrate conservative budgeting as much as it did before.
So thank you to that point, because I think that highlights for the community the shift we're making in planning, which at least from support services for our colleagues who weren't able to take part. You know, last week was a great session. I believe that video is online for anyone else in the community who still wants to view that. This is a shift from, and you described, at the end of each year, we'd have a surplus, because typically we weren't as conservative in that. In our projection, that worked out, that was nice. But this seems like more of a shift, an adult discussion to go, as we have more conservative figures, less revenue, we're headed towards a deficit. I liken it to, in any of our households, you can live off of your tax refund. Well, we're not getting a tax refund anymore as North Penn School District. Those days are over, which is why we need that 10-year plan with the projections so we can budget accordingly. Is that a safe way to?
Great analogy. It is. And I think it's also important to talk about the context of where North Penn stands relative to our peers. You know, we talk about benchmarking quite a bit, and we had some discussion about this last year as well. Let's face it, no one likes real estate taxes. It's a very unpopular tax. But we want to measure where North Penn is relative to our peers, because North Penn is a great bargain. It's a very high-achieving school district at an excellent cost, the cost to the taxpayer. And that's demonstrated by the fact that we have the 5th lowest tax rate in Montgomery County. And what's also important to note is that we are 25% below the countywide average. That's a pretty significant figure. And so we're 5th lowest, and the 6th lowest isn't even close to us. So we're not in danger of moving to the 6th lowest or 7th lowest. So the 5th lowest, that's pretty impressive when you look at the results of the student performance here at North Penn School District. It's really important to keep that in the context relative to our peers here in Montgomery County.
And thank you, and thank you everyone for indulging in my education here on the issue. Last question, how many years, and maybe it's Dr. Dietrich, you have some context as well, deficit spending at North Penn School District, how often in the last 5 or 10 years has that occurred?
Oh, we've had deficit budgets for virtually every year that I can recall, going way back.
I think that's a very important understanding for context.
And like Steve was saying, part of that is there is a budgetary reserve that we have not dipped into. And then various things have happened. You know, whether some revenues came in a little better than we had anticipated, or we did under-expend the expenditure budget. More recently, we were transferring the under-expended expenditure budget to the capital reserve fund. And we would do that for years also, maybe not to the full extent, but we were moving money to the capital reserve budget for years out of the expenditure budget.
Well, thank you very much. That gives me a much better understanding. And makes me realize that what we're going through, these aren't necessarily radical decisions. They're very important, but understanding the context in order to go forward, this information is helpful. Thank you.
I'd like to.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you as well for trying to get us the best information that we can have, given all of the things that we cannot yet know, particularly as we wait for a speech to come tomorrow and hope that as it goes through the legislature, we get a better deal. The extent to which the Commonwealth controls the purse strings, as you said in the past, I believe, is extraordinary. Given only the charts we've seen tonight about our contribution towards retirements and limitations like that. So thank you for doing the best you can with what we have and what we know, and hopefully we get good news and can work towards better funding models in the future.
Thank you.
My question is actually just about the modest increase in the tax base this year. Is that two parts? One, is that part of a larger trend, or is that something that we sort of saw happen this year? And then two, how does that number compare relative to other districts in the county?
So this is not a positive trend. This is what I would consider an aberration compared to previous years, with the exception of 2 years ago. We had a situation like this. It was about 2 years ago. And you might recall I mentioned about there was one particular property that was divested from Merck and was purchased by a new business owner who filed an assessment appeal. It resulted in a $30+ million reduction in the assessed value. Basically stripped the school district of $750,000 a year in revenue per year. That year was very similar to this 0.13% increase that year. In fact, it was even lower than that. But historically here in North Penn, our average has been roughly 0.5%, maybe a tick below that, but 0.5% has been the average for North Penn School District over a longer period of time. So this year in particular, it is driven to a large extent by new tax assessment appeals and reductions that were made at the county level. So my expectation is that it reverts back to the 0.45 to 0.5%. Now, to answer your question about other school districts in Montgomery County, I think it really depends on where you look at. I can tell you in Upper Marion area school district, they're seeing incredible gains of their tax base. Theirs is closer to like 0.8 or 0.9% per year because of development that's occurring in that school district. But I think, 0.4, 0.45% is probably the countywide range of an average. Some districts are higher, some districts are lower. There still could be some districts, I don't want to name the district, but I can think of, I'm envisioning one district in my mind that still may be experiencing negative growth in their tax base through a result of assessment appeals. But it's a different type of a school district than North Penn School District, but it is located in Montgomery County, and districts like that are faced with declining tax bases. That's not uncommon. It's very uncommon for a suburban school district like North Penn, suburban Philadelphia School District, to only see a 0.13% increase.
Yeah, and given the challenges right now with retail property, or retail business, it's somewhat encouraging to hear that you don't see this as a new normal, perhaps, that while that may impact this, it's not such a strong, because we've seen a couple businesses close around here, some larger stores, unfortunately shutter. And I would assume that would have some effect also on the assessment appeals and whatnot.
It does. And you mentioned a good point about the changing nature of retail in the United States. It's moving from brick and mortar to online. Mm-hmm. We've seen it with the closures of the likes of Sears and Toys R Us and Babies R Us and JCPenney. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And as those stores become dark, they're ripe for an assessment appeal because the valuation of those particular properties is driven by the lease rates. Typically, those properties are leased by, an organization. And as the lease revenue drives up, that drives down the value of the property. And again, it makes it ripe for a tax assessment appeal by the property owner. And it's justified, quite frankly, if there's no lease revenue coming into a particular property. And this 0.13% increase does reflect some of those big boxes that have shuttered over the past year in North Penn School District. So, we're hopeful that with increases in other properties and with limited development, That will get us back to the 0.45 or 0.5%. I'll be very concerned if 0.13% becomes the norm, because if that does become the norm, that completely changes our 5-year modeling, completely changes it. You know, $242,000 added in revenue to the tax base when you're dealing with overall revenues over $260 million is a rounding error. It's a pittance. It doesn't do anything, really, $242,000.
Given that this is the preliminary discussion, do you foresee any changes in that number?
Absolutely. We get information monthly from the county. So typically, the tax base grows. And the assessment appeal reductions are already reflected in the numbers, because the way the appeals work, the county, if they're going to make a reduction at the county level, they're typically made in September. So they're already baked into this number. There really shouldn't be any additional assessment appeal reduction pressure on the tax base. So every month from here till May, we pretty much lock in with the May number. The tax base should increase. Now, the question is, how much will it increase through the interims? That's the question. It certainly won't go from 0.13% to 0.5% in the next couple months. It definitely won't. If we can eke out another $100,000 or $200,000 in revenue, that's probably the more likely scenario. So with the preliminary budget, again, we would ask for approval to place this on the work session agenda for Tuesday night, February 12th, 2019, in this room, starting at 7:30 p.m. There'll be another presentation. At the conclusion of the presentation, we'd ask for the board's approval of the 1920 preliminary budget, as well as application to the Department of Education for exceptions. Again, I'll state it again, it can't be stated enough. Application for Act 1 exceptions doesn't mean they need to be used.
So moved.
Second.
Any additional questions, comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, since I'm up here, if I can move on to sort of off agenda, but to debt service, is that okay? I have a brief debt service presentation. I'd like to talk about our debt schedule. This is a pretty significant part of our overall budget. So in lines with our departmental administrators presenting the budget, we'll hear more of those presentations in February and in March. We try to segment the budget. It's such a large budget, $270+ million. We try to talk about the budget in departments or segments to make it a little more understandable about the various components. So I'll briefly talk about our debt schedule, talk about our bond rating, and a couple other items. So a debt schedule is basically how you repay principal and interest on a bond, like a mortgage schedule, amortization schedule. So here is North Penn School District's amortization schedule, including the bond sale, the 2019 issue that we had just last week. So our debt is our gross debt. We do get some reimbursement from the state, not much, but some. Our debt next year is slated to go to roughly $16 million, roughly $16 million in the upcoming year. And you see how there's a drop-off in some of the bars starting like in the 2021 year. When we talk about future borrowing and leveling debt and wraparound debt, that's an attempt to keep those bars pretty much equal over a number of years. Right now, they're unequal, which means it gives the district great flexibility with regard to bringing on new debt for projects. So once the debt is baked into the budget, and we have about $16 million next year, once that's in, if you can maintain that level over a 10 or a 15 or a 20-year period, you're able to bring in new debt without having any impact in terms of additional taxation. So we have a pretty favorable debt schedule. With the exception of the last two bond issues, all of our debt was 10-year debt and expired in 10 years. So the out years, from years 10 to 15 on this chart, that's all from the 2018 and 2019 bond issue for Napa Elementary School. So our total outstanding debt, 83% of our total comes from principal, 17% comes from interest. Here's just a snapshot of our bond rating report from Moody's that was issued on January 25th. Our rating was maintained at a AA1, stable, AA1 stable. And again, we are one of only 18 school districts in the state of Pennsylvania that have a AA1 or higher rating. There are about 7 school districts that have a AAA rating. That's the next step up. You have AA1, and then you go up to AAA. That's the next rating. A couple of years ago, we were at AA2. That's one notch below our current rating. We were able to get that increase because of the fund balance. I want to mention a term that you may have heard of before, may not have, but it's a term that'll be important as we look at potential projects in the future. It's called borrowing capacity. And that's simply how much legally is a school district able to borrow. Okay, there's an actual debt limit. You can't borrow an infinite amount of money. There's a debt limit. And there's a calculation that goes into that, and then it takes away your current outstanding principal. So I'll get to the bottom line. The bottom line is North Penn School District, based on the calculation, we could borrow an additional $435 million in debt legally. Doesn't mean we will. Doesn't mean we can afford it with our budget, but $435 million is the maximum we would be permitted to borrow in the future. And as we talk about future borrowing, there's a number of factors that we need to take into consideration. We need to talk about the term, that's the length of the bond issue. Historically, it's been 10 years, so maybe 15 years is a better structure, maybe 20 years is a better structure. We need to talk about the amount that will be borrowed, and that ties into the discussions that we're having in the Facilities and Operations Committee with a number of options with respect to the high school, with respect to a ninth grade addition, and middle schools. We have to talk about what the borrowing rates are going to be. If interest rates stay in the current environment, that's probably a good thing. We need to talk about what impact that has on taxes. And finally, we need to start having discussions about a hedge strategy, There's a mechanism in place where it gives you the ability to, in essence, lock in at today's interest rates, regardless if rates increase in the future. It's a hedge strategy that's been employed by a number of school districts that have been borrowing over the past year or two. And I'd like to bring in PFM to do a brief presentation about this hedge strategy at some point in the future. But the point to remember with the hedge strategy is you can, in essence, lock in today's rates, even though your borrowing might not occur for 2 years. Whether rates go up or whether rates go down, you're pretty much come back to the current rates. It's a hedge strategy. 10-year MMD, this is really the bond index that's used for 10-year borrowings. Municipal market data is what the MMD stands for. And in the far right of that chart shows history back to 1998, but in the far right you'll see that dip in late 18, early 19. That dip is what we took advantage of when we borrowed money last week for the 2019 bond issue. So historically, rates are pretty darn low where they're at right now. So the 10-year MMD right now is about 2.2%. Historically, that's pretty darn good. The average since 1998 over the past 20 years is 3.22%. So we're roughly 1% or 100 basis points less than the 20-year average. Also, I mentioned during the budget presentation that we had a technology lease come off the books. I'm not a fan personally of leases. I'd like for the district to divest itself from leases, and we're heading in that direction. We did shed a significant portion of our lease payments in the upcoming year. We shed about $1.4 million out of the budget. And in the 2021 year, we will be completely free of any leases. The one for the 1920 year is for a few bus leases that we had from several years ago. Once they're paid in the 1920 year, we have no more leases at all that we need to repay in the school district. So that's just a real quick overview of school district debt and what we're looking at for potential future borrowings. Questions?
And just to clarify, Mr. Scrocky, there was a statement in a previous PowerPoint that indicated $1 million of new debt. That you meant to say was the increase from the general obligation bonds of 2019 and then the 2018 that we had, but the overall debt service didn't increase $1 million.
The overall debt service increased $1 million.
So we had an overall local effort. If we go to that one, it's coming up here soon. Ending 2019 at $14,631,000, and the one ending 6/30 of 2020 anticipated to be $15,115,000.
So when we talk about local effort, that's a different measure than what's on the screen here. What's on the screen now is gross debt. Local effort subtracts what's called the rental subsidy. That's through PlanCon money that used to be available. So this is from prior building projects. For the 1920 year, I think it's roughly $923,000 that we'll receive in the rental subsidy. So that changes, and in fact, in 4 or 5 years, we will no longer receive any PlanCon rental subsidy, at all. So that would be the local effort. So the $1 million increase is the actual increase over the current fiscal year compared to next year.
So in that debt service of 630 of 19, 15,723 versus 16,034,000. I'm on the page, we'll probably need to get into that next anyway, I guess, right? The results of the recent borrowing. So that's 4B, the 2019 bond issue. Did you want to go there next, or where do you want to
Okay,
go?
are we finished with this?
That'd
Yeah, I
probably
think
be
so.
good. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I'm going to go sit down if that's okay. Okay, so we are on, oh, can we switch over to, somebody might need to switch that over to the scorecard, if that's okay? Okay. So, Dr. Dietrich, you had a question on 4B. Okay, 4B is the results of our 2019 bond issue, but I think to address your question, when I talk about the increase, I'm looking at the debt schedule for the 2018 and 19 bond issue for the 19-20 year, and that's slightly over $1 million. So, for example, for the 2018 bond issue, our repayment of the 2018 bond issue, which is non-reimbursable, we receive no plan con money for that. That is about $480,000.
Correct.
And for the 2019 bond issue, it is roughly $550,000 in debt that we're paying for the 2019 bond issue. So added together, it's about $1 million in additional debt due to the 18 and 19 bond
Right.
issue.
But not in debt service, because the
We had a
numbers above that are
reduction, right.
15,723 and
Right.
16,034.
Correct. So it's a good point to clarify. So there was $1 million addition because of the 18 and 19 bond issue, but the overall debt budget did not go up by $1 million, because actually we actually had a reduction that was slated to incur in the debt schedule.
Is that a wash, or did it actually?
Well, 15,
So the actual increase budget to budget is about $300,000.
15,7 versus 16,030. Okay.
So what that means is that our debt would have actually decreased, but we had these new bond issues, so now it's actually going up budget to budget by about $300,000. It would have decreased $700,000.
So that's a little over 2%. 15 million to 15.7 to 16.0.
So also on 4B, just a recap real quickly on the bond issue. The bonds were sold last week, January 20th. There were 7 bidders, which is outstanding participation. That's 3 more than what we had back in October. The arbitrage yield, which is really the yield that is looked at by the underwriters in terms of what the cost of the deal was 2.55%. When we did a deal 3 months ago, it was 3.05%. So again, we took advantage of the major reduction in interest rates that occurred from the end of November through January. The term of the deal is 15 years, just like the one that was done in 2018. So overall, we're very pleased with the results of that sale. It's kind of interesting, I mentioned to Kristen last week, it's amazing that typically a bond issue, when you start talking about a bond issue until you sell the bonds, it's typically like a 3-month process. I made a phone call to PFM in early January, and we sold the bonds on January 20th. So that's basically a 3-week period as opposed to a 3-month period to get everything done. That includes a rating call with Moody's. That includes updating the prospectus, which is called an official statement. So all that happened in a 3-week period. It's a pretty amazing turnaround time in terms of a timeline. Settlement is scheduled for March the 6th. Any questions about the bond issue?
So this is critically important, and I think the board has to become very, very familiar with, this attachment here, particularly as we endeavor to plan our future debt service. As you scroll through here and you get down to, for example, some of the latter pages as we get into this whole area, you can see what our existing debt is, what the various series are that we have, and how much debt is expected to come off. And then, very importantly, in that right-hand column, on total, either if you want to go in total debt service or in total local effort, trying to keep that within an Act 1 increase. So I'm on page 12, for example, in the attachment that Steve was just going over. And if you look at that, you can see that we do have the general obligation bonds series of 2010 that is just about finished, dropping down from 8 million down to 2 in 2020 and then being done. The 2010 Series A, another about 6 million dropping off there. So you can see for yourself when you see all the totals over to the side, what we're looking at there if we do nothing. And we know we have needs, so we're trying to see what can we do by adding additional debt service that stays within the Act 1 index if at all possible. And one of the things Steve talked about is the cash-infused settlement, or cash-settled settlement idea. We're going to bring in PFM and Scott Schurer and Wes Hall to talk more about that. It's something I think the board has to spend a lot of time knowing and understanding, and if they feel comfortable, that is one option to manage future increases.
Okay, if I could move back now to, we have two items yet that are recommended for work session. If we could tackle those, please. Item 3A. This is the Montgomery County Intermediate Unit budget. This is their membership budget. North Penn's share is $211,000. There's a $1,900 increase, or 0.91% increase over the current year. We do have that figure reflected in the current draft of the budget. The membership services budget is composed of three parts: the Office of Community and Government Relations, Professional Learning, and Technology Services. And Mrs. Ramich, I believe this was already approved by the MCIU board, and now it's up for consideration by the local school districts, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Any highlights you'd like to mention? I mean, it's a pretty level budget. Our share is going up slightly because of enrollment changes and changes with the market value aid ratio that they use to calculate these budgets. But any other highlights that you'd
Yeah,
like to?
overall, that represents no increase, so the only increase is because of changes that happen within our own district. And this represents only 1% of the MCIU budget. So this is just for those services. The vast majority of the MCIU budget is rooted in federal and state funding.
So we'd like to have the board move this forward to the February action meeting, and then we can respond back to the MCIU board that it's been addressed by North Penn.
So moved.
Second.
Additional questions, comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? All right.
Okay, next item is the North Monco Technical Career Center budget. Now, this budget hasn't been vetted yet by the Joint Operating Committee, so this is a draft of their budget. They do expect the JOC to consider this at their February meeting, so we're asking for this to be put forth at our March action meeting. But in sum, North Monco uses a 5-year rolling average with respect to enrollment to determine our share of tuition. And North Penn has been seeing an increase in enrollment over the past couple of years. So for the upcoming year, the 5-year average, North Penn has a 41% share compared to the other districts. So that means that even though we have the same situation here at North Monco, their budget, their overall budget is only going up by 2.3%, but North Penn share is going up by 3.08%, and that's because we have a larger share of the overall pie because of our enrollment. So the total budget, the North Penn share, is $3.8 million. That represents a $113,000 increase, or 3.08%. We also have a portion of debt service. They had a renovation project a couple years ago, so we have a portion of debt service as well. That's $316,000. So all in, it's roughly $4.1 million the North Penn share. And we do have that exact figure reflected in the draft of the budget. We'd ask that you move this forward to the March action meeting for approval, once the JOC approves it. Second.
Questions, comments? I know that having served on that board for several years, it's a lean budget over there. There's not a lot of excess in that budget, so they keep the increases as close as they can to the Act 1 index or below, so. Anybody else? All in favor? Aye. Anybody opposed? All right, that'll move forward for March.
Okay, now we're back to informational items, two remaining items. First is item 4D, engineering study, air conditioning. This item was discussed last week at the Facilities and Operations Committee, and that committee asked for the Finance Committee to consider it. It's a proposal of $33,300 to have the architect and engineer provide cost estimates to air condition the 3 middle schools at North Penn School District. And after having some discussion internally, the administrative recommendation is to defer decision on this study until the various facility study options are further examined. We think we'll be in a better position once we determine what exactly is on the table with respect to the 3 middle schools. So instead of spending the money right now, further vet those options, and perhaps in a month or 2 months or 3 months, we come back and revisit the proposal that we received to air condition or study and cost estimates for air conditioning of the 3 middle schools.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea at this time. Everybody agree? Yep. Okay, all right, so we will not act on that currently.
And we'll bring that back then to this committee once we have further vetting of the facility options. The last item I have on the agenda, we briefly talked about at the January action meeting. This is just a summary of the 2018 tax liens. These would be the parcels in North Penn School District that didn't pay their tax bill by December 31st of the year. And it's important to note that there was a $202,000 increase in the delinquent properties this year compared to last year. We were on a downward trend for 3 years. This broke that trend, unfortunately. So it was a $202,000 increase. That was a 15% increase in delinquent. So it gets back to what I've been droning on about tighter budgets, right? Because this is real estate revenue that isn't collected now this year. It might be collected next year, could be the year after that or the year after that. Depends if the individual puts it on a payment plan with the county. So what I look at is the amount of real estate revenue that was collected through December this year versus last year. Last year, we collected 100.7% of the budget, meaning we collected more than what was budgeted by 107%, or 100.7%. This year, that figure is only 100.3%. Again, illustrates that we collected fewer dollars with respect to the budgeted revenue. So that basically summarizes our tax liens for the upcoming year. It's a trend we monitor pretty closely, and it typically does trend along with economic activity. I think that's why we had a 3-year reduction. There was a couple larger properties included on the list this year. One in particular, I'm thinking, owed over $100,000 in real estate tax that was unpaid. So my understanding is it's a unique situation that the property's in bankruptcy. That may or may not have anything to do with economic activity, but that's one of the reasons why at least $100,000 out of that figure wasn't collected. So the board does it. The board has already acted to ratify this. The tax liens, the unpaid bills, just for your information, had to be turned over to the county by mid-January, so there's always a timing issue. That's why the board ratifies the list, because there's only a 2-week period between the end of December and the time they have to be turned over to the county. Okay, that concludes all the informational items, Mr. Diazio. Thank
Great.
you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so to summarize, we've got the MCIU budget moving forward to the action meeting in February, the North Monco Technical Career Center budget moving to action in March, and the 2019-2020 preliminary budget moving to the work session meeting next week, and then we'll be scheduling an action meeting to take action on that following the work session?
Yes, there'll be action at that work session, correct?
Okay. Yep. All right, so we're into our second and final public comment period for the evening. If there's any public comment.
Well, I have to bring a little disappointment to this informational session. You know that in statistics, how many people are retiring or reaching age 65. It's about 3 million people a year are retiring. And I told you what my plan is for the North Penn School District. I'm going to move to Florida. You know why? When my wife takes out her 401k, she won't have any income tax due to Pennsylvania on her 401k. And as you know, you refund illusions. Nobody is going to get a refund, because you know why? We have the state and local taxes. I call it the low salt diet. I guarantee you, when this district and these people do their income tax and you join in there and they pay $8,000 or $7,000, probably pretty nice out in Upper Gwinnett. They say, oh yeah, we spent all our money on North Penn School District. I doubt in Costa Rica they're going to be real happy over there in Upper Gwinnett. You know how many houses I got empty on my street now? They still own them. 3 houses. They're doing what I told them to do. They're smart. You know why? Because you're going to make a fantastic place, but I don't rent it. No one, you're not going to get any new customers, because I can pick the phone up and by the tax code, I can still deduct $1 million of mortgage. So at any time, I can liberate a whole lot of money at a very low rate. I'm glad the rates are low. You don't seem to understand the implications of what has happened. You get deductions, 2 dependents. Wow, what about the family with 8 kids? They'll just have to suffer through it. I don't see any empathy coming out of the federal government, and I don't hear any empathy in Crawford County or Tioga County. You know what they say? You know what? We don't care what happens down in Montgomery County. They can take care of themselves. When you get to the other upper tiers in Pennsylvania, it's bright red in this mega country, and you know what they say? We don't care about your social programs, or whatever you're thinking of doing, and we don't want to subsidize your FICA payments. This is how they really are. You know what they like? They like log cabins, living off the grid, 4-wheel drives, the shotgun, and whatever. They don't care. Your agenda is totally different. And Pennsylvania is actually a cobbled, it's almost like Iraq. It was cobbled together. Pennsylvania is a cobbled unit. Upstate and western state and down there, they all think differently. That's why nothing gets done in Harrisburg, because those people that Todd Stevens is talking to, they're all bright red. I don't care what you want. I'm not going to give you a dime. Now, we have the governor, Mr. Wolf. He's on his own agenda. You know, he's trying to get some shale gas revenue. But I'm telling you, this young man, where's he going? He's going to California. My son was here. Where'd he? He's in South Carolina. You know what their homestead exemption is? My nephew, I looked at his house. Got about a $500,000 house. Pays $2,500 school tax. $2,500. I couldn't believe it. But then I looked down. I said, what's your homestead exemption? $2,500. You don't pay any school taxes? No, not in Beckley County. I said, no wonder everybody's moving down here, because you know what? The biggest problem they have, people that are escaping from New York, New Jersey, all these high-tax state, bright blue people, they're all moving down there because they're sick and tired and they're not going to put up with it. So you have to be very careful about what you create here, because I'll tell you what, these $600 townhouses, $600,000 townhouses, I guess they think, they're not selling anymore. Over there at the junction over there, those houses are dead in the water. They built one more unit. That's why Lennar had to take it over, because you know what? The other guy couldn't stay in the game. So what I'm telling you is, all these things are coming to fruition. You're going to have a terrible time. Stop talking about borrowing $400 million for the high school. It's ridiculous.
All right, thank you. Our next meeting is February 12th, and just note to the committee, it's a 6 o'clock meeting, not a 6:30 meeting here. All right, motion to adjourn? All right, everybody